Extinction Rebellion is the radical environmental movement that calls on governments to tell the truth. Do they practice what they preach? Well, let's find out. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for changemakers. In this video, I'm going to draw on statements made by a leading light of the Extinction Rebellion movement. So not just focusing on random people who get put on the spot at demonstrations and not random slips made under aggressive questioning by journalists, just some of the settled statements that the group makes in the course of its work of recruiting young people to swell its ranks. In particular, I'm going to be drawing from a standard talk given by official spokesperson Rupert Read, supplemented by statements by group founder Roger Hallam. I'll provide links for all of the original sources below so that you can check for yourself that I'm not quoting out of context or misrepresenting. Let's start with the talk by Rupert Read. This is how he starts it.
So I want to start out by addressing the younger people in the room, which is the majority of you, younger than me. And what I want to say to you is slightly stark, is this: that your leaders have failed you, your governments have failed you, your parents and their generation have failed you, your teachers have failed you, and I've failed you. And what I mean by that is that we have all failed to warn adequately and to prevent the dangerous climate change that is now here and that is coming and that is definitely going to get a lot worse, definitely. And because of that failure, I'm afraid for you. I have fear for you. I fear that some of you are unlikely to grow old. And there's nothing really worse for human beings than not being able to take adequate care of the next generation.
Now for me, that's a summary of our problem right there. The main thrust of recruitment has been young people, join us or die. At a point when we're worried about rising levels of mental health problems in young people, looking them in the eyes and saying, sorry, you're going to die young because of climate change, well, I believe that's probably an effective recruiting tool, whilst at the same time being a disgusting and irresponsible thing to do. Bad enough to say it in such terms if it's true, and because there are plenty of ways that you could frame that message differently. But frankly, wicked if it's not. So it deserves some closer scrutiny. The first thing to note is why this has been part of the group's success. It has made climate change a visceral and emotional issue with the use of such language. Whereas campaign groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth that have been more cautious in sticking strictly to the science and have had only moderate success in mobilising people, Extinction Rebellion has employed emotional framing like this to enjoy far more success. Not just in talks like this, but then in group actions like pouring red paint on the street and calling it the blood of our children. In case you wonder whether that's really a deliberate tactic or not, I make no claims to be a mind reader, and I generally distrust perspectives that believe they can attest to ill intent or deviousness on the part of other people. But fortunately in this case you don't have to be a mind reader, because Rupert Read tells you exactly what he's doing. Later on in the talk, Read is asked a question about how to bring around sceptical family members to the truth on climate change. Here's that exchange.
I was wondering how you recommend going about talking to people about this, because I've been trying to talk to my family and friends about this for the past few weeks, and I think they're ready to get me sectioned.
Yeah. Okay, so I've tried to model some of it. So one thing which I think is quite important is creating some kind of emotional resonance. And that's one of the reasons why I always say something like, I'm afraid for you.
He can't help but congratulate himself on how clever he is, and in so doing he basically owns up to the games he's playing with his audience to create an emotional response as part of his attempt to persuade. Well, okay, we could argue about this, but of course If what they put forward is factually accurate and the young people really are going to die early of climate change, then you could argue that, well, yes, it's blunt, but it's better that people know the truth. I would still argue that there are better ways to frame it, but there are some grim truths to be known, and it's an arguable point. So let's have a look at exactly what he's saying in terms of the facts that he's putting over. After his shocking and attention-grabbing opener, Read goes on with a relentless barrage of bad news science.
But it's much worse than that. But it's worse than that. But it's worse than that. You see, there's a pattern emerging here. But it's worse than that.
Each of these, layered one on top of the other, feeds a downward spiral of despair in the listener, which is a rhetorical device that can be very effective. Let's see the first claim.
Well, let's talk about the Paris Agreement, because that's what is supposed to be giving us all hope around dangerous climate change. Yeah? So the first thing to say about Paris is that, of course, Paris was now a few years ago, and things have got quite a bit worse since then. The world's weather systems appear to be spinning out of control. Just in the last 3 years, basically, since around the time of Paris.
The weather spinning out of control in the last 3 years? No, not really. We have been seeing more extreme weather events over a considerable time frame beyond the last 3 years, which is in line with the sort of effects we expect to see. Yes, it's a solid indicator of the real-life impact of climate change. It hasn't suddenly gotten worse in the last 3 years to suggest that what we expected before the Paris Agreement has been shown to be wrong. Now, it's volatile because exact weather patterns are highly variable. Certain phenomena are ahead of predictions, others not. And you can point to individual ones to make your point. But spinning out of control is a polemic, not a scientific assessment. The weather's never been under control. It's a meaningless statement.
Well, the most recent was, you may have heard that there is new scientific evidence about the extent to which heat has been stored in the oceans, a lot more than was previously recognized. And that's a kind of ticking time bomb part of the global overheating problem, which is not going to go away.
This one is true. We have found that there is more heat stored in the oceans than we expected. We knew about the phenomenon generally, but the extent was more than we thought. This means that some of that heat will be emitted at a future date, and it's not great news. It doesn't mean that we expect the young people of today to die.
Next problem with Paris, of course, is that, as we all know, the most powerful man in the world, from what is in practice really still the most polluting nation in the world, the United States. The most powerful man in the world, the most powerful country in the world, has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is a pretty devastating hammer blow against Paris.
Well, yes, America is currently not part of the Paris Agreement. To be fair, in recent years, America has reduced emissions more than most European countries. So while we're working on the process of changing the political consensus in that country, there is at least some momentum to build on. But that current fact is still hardly the end of the story.
Actually, the commitments that countries have made towards those Paris targets are well short of what would be required in order to meet those targets. Right? Countries voluntarily commit under Paris to say what are they going to do to meet their Paris obligations. And if you add all those up, and people have added them all up, they come to considerably less than what Paris requires in order to work.
At the point of this recording, the agreement was maybe 3 years old. That's a little early to be coming to conclusions about implementation. Since Rupert Read's talk, we have seen further progress. We've seen a number of governments, the UK being one of those leading the charge, that have set the target of net zero by 2050 as being both technically possible and being required to meet the Paris target. Not everyone else has signed up yet because, well, yeah, of course, it's a process. And there will be leaders and laggards, and we need good people to be part of making it happen because it won't happen by itself. Rupert Read could have decided to use his platform to seek to recruit young people to get involved in helping to make it happen because it's our best hope. But that's not his message. His message is that we're almost certainly dead. It's not a scientific statement. It's a prediction based on not much more than gloom. But let's move on because, as he's about to tell us, It's worse than that.
But it's worse than that. You see, there's a pattern emerging here. Because actually, the commitments that countries have made, the commitments that governments have made to reach those Paris targets are actually in stark contradiction to what virtually every single one of those governments, with possibly the exception of Bhutan, are planning to do over the next 10 years or so. So virtually every country in the world has plans to encourage further economic growth, has plans to encourage the building of, or simply to build, a lot more infrastructure, transport infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, etc. Most of those plans, not all, but most of those plans stand in opposition to the possibility of achieving those Paris commitments.
This is just wrong. It's predicated on a policy assertion that economic growth necessarily produces emissions, and that in response to climate change, the Paris Agreement says we should be shutting everything down. The recent Committee on Climate Change technical report showed in detail how the UK could switch to zero and low carbon energy infrastructure and achieve net zero emissions while still progressing economically as a society. Transport infrastructure for electric cars, powered by zero carbon energy, and electric buses, and hydrogen powered HGVs. I've covered some of the details of this in several of the previous videos. Some of those details are open to debate, but the plain assertion that any economic activity must necessarily be pushing against reducing emissions is plainly false. Now, it may involve certain things that Rupert Read and his friends won't like, such as some additional nuclear power capacity for baseload energy. But hey, it's a crisis, remember?
But it's worse than that. Because the IPCC, the worst thing arguably about the IPCC process is that it seriously underestimates the possibility of feedbacks which could spiral the climate system out of control, and which may already be kicking in, potentially explaining the disastrous weather chaos of the last few years. Among those feedbacks are the albedo loss feedback. So that's the loss of ice, for instance, in the Arctic. And the less ice you have, the less heat and light gets reflected, the more gets absorbed. And there are scientists who suspect that the albedo loss situation is a lot worse than the IPCC have taken into account.
Now, in that phrase right there, I want to draw your attention to something. He says there are scientists who suspect that. Big flag right there. Because it's a clear admission that what he's about to say does not reflect broader scientific consensus. As the critics of climate change will be the first to point out, some scientists said decades ago we were heading for another ice age. And usually those critics claim it was the consensus then, as climate change is the consensus now, which is factually wrong. It was just a few outliers who got picked up and amplified by newspaper headlines. And so when Rupert Read says some scientists have suggested, we should question which scientists and why them and not others. Is it because they're the most moderate ones? Is it because they're the ones with the most peer-reviewed papers or the most citations for the work they've done, giving them the most credibility? Or could it just be that they're the ones whose predictions push to the extremes that might be utilised to back up Rupert Read's claim that you're all going to die?
I'll leave it to you to guess.
Seriously, if you're worried about this, you have to ask yourself who's trying to persuade you of what and to what end. But anyway, let's look at some of the specific claims. The albedo effect is a thing, but as he tacitly admits, here it's known and taken into account by the IPCC. He quotes certain scientists who suspect that maybe they should be more. There are all sorts of people who suspect all sorts of things. It's not a strong enough evidential base to tell young people they're going to die.
And most scarily of all is the situation vis-à-vis methane, which we know now is starting to be released in significant quantities, again, mostly from the Arctic, from the permafrost, etc. And, well, they call it the methane dragon, those who are in the know about this. And they call it the methane dragon for a reason. I mean, dragons are a sort of icon of something kind of terrifying, overwhelming, out of control. If that methane release starts to accelerate, which might already be happening, and may well happen in a big way over the next 5, 10, 15 years, well, that locks us into catastrophic climate change, probably runaway climate change, because you then start getting a further vicious circle of more ice being melted, more methane being released, etc. And the crucial thing to remember about methane is that methane is a greenhouse gas approximately 25 times as powerful as carbon dioxide.
Might be happening, may do this, pure speculation. Rupert Read mentions correctly that methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. What he doesn't mention is that unlike CO2, which is persistent in the atmosphere, methane degrades very quickly, leaving CO2 in its wake. Now, that doesn't mean that it's no cause for concern, but it's not as simple as saying that it's 25 times more powerful, as though that's a simple like-for-like comparison. One of the apocalyptic visions that Extinction Rebellion draws upon is the book The Uninhabitable Earth, which was based on a long article of the same name by the same author. It's one of the sources for the proposition methane release from Arctic permafrost. Now, in response to those claims, a number of climate scientists were asked of their opinion. Michael Mann, who is a campaigning climate scientist leading the charge for the issue to be taken seriously, said this: "The article paints an overly bleak picture by overstating some of the science. It exaggerates, for example, the near-term threat of climate feedbacks involving the release of frozen methane. The science of this is much more nuanced and doesn't support the notion of a game-changing, planet-melting methane bomb. It is unclear that much of this frozen methane can be readily mobilised by projected warming." And he goes on to add this: "The evidence that climate change is a serious problem that we must contend with now is overwhelming on its own. There is no need to overstate the evidence, particularly when it feeds a paralysing narrative of doom and hopelessness." I agree with the climate scientist. In addition, Christopher Close of NASA said this: "There is no evidence that a very abrupt methane source will be readily mobilised into the atmosphere. Such scenarios are not supported by process studies, it is not emerging observationally, and is not borne out paleoclimatically, particularly in the mid-Holocene or Eemian interglacial, where high-latitude summers were hotter than today. A small trickle of CH4 release is very plausible, but methane becomes converted to CO2 pretty quickly in Earth's atmosphere, and there's already some 200 times more CO2 in the air than CH4. These types of carbon cycle feedbacks will likely give the direct anthropogenic climate input just a small boost in the near future. Incidentally, even the methane that is currently being released from the seabed doesn't give a clear picture. Plumes of methane bubbling up in Siberia have been found to predate human-caused climate change, and some of those plumes, counterintuitively, show a net removal of atmospheric greenhouse gases by stimulating the growth of plankton that consume CO2. Now look, that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, nor a suggestion that methane isn't a factor that won't have to be part of what we're addressing. It's just not as straightforward as Rupert Read suggests it is. Plus, one more aspect.
Well, that locks us into catastrophic climate change, probably runaway climate change.
Runaway climate change is the suggestion that there's just a catalogue of chain reactions that leads to massive increases. And in a separate talk, Read talks about the boiling of the oceans and the Earth becoming like Venus. There is a huge degree of scientific agreement. We are nowhere near triggering anything like that. So those are key points from Read's speech. I wanted quickly also to quote Extinction Rebellion founder Roger Hallam, just to show how this gets synthesised into some throwaway lines.
Given that we are objectively in a climate emergency and it's likely to lead to mass starvation and various other sort of unimaginable sort of levels of suffering in the next generation. So when, a structural opportunity comes along where an elite is proposing the mass suicide of the next generation, then you do have a structural opportunity to create a social movement.
In another interview, Hallam specifically suggests that after several degrees of warming, grains won't grow, hence his comment here about mass starvation. Now, none of that is supported by the mainstream science that suggests that while 2 degrees plus will reduce yields from existing crops by a relatively small amount, not taking into account the possibilities of substituting more resistant crops, nevertheless, there's no suggestion that crops won't grow. And yes, we'll see more incidences of the sorts of droughts we've seen in the past, leading to crop failures in specific locations. Those scenarios do not justify Hallam's throwaway lines here. Now, you'd be surprised if I was the first person who'd pointed some of these things out to Extinction Rebellion. And indeed, if you look at the science part of their own website, it is generally more nuanced than the public pronouncement. It's not 100% error-free. When I interviewed Roger Hallam for my podcast, he basically dealt with the objections like this. He didn't say that they were quoting the extreme outlier examples of the science, but he did rather acknowledge it in one of the things he did say. He said that if something was considered by scientists to have only a 5% chance of happening, a precautionary approach should still make that unacceptable. His well-rehearsed line was, if you were putting your child onto a plane you were told had a 5% chance of crashing, you wouldn't think those were good enough odds to do it. And it's a good line. Of course, he's probably right. But that's very different to looking young people in the face and saying you're probably going to die early. Come on. One is a spur for us not to be complacent. The other one is a vehicle to provoke hopelessness and despair. It's a serious question, not an academic one. I wait with trepidation for first instances of young people taking their own lives because they become convinced they're doomed anyway and there's nothing to live for. And hey, Rupert and Roger, here's something to think about. Even if there's only a 5% chance of that happening, radicalising young people with those messages, that will lead to that outcome, that's something you should still take seriously, don't you think? Now, of course, this despair is designed to achieve another end. It's a slim hope, but just maybe, if you join Extinction Rebellion, we can avoid this. But we have to be totally committed to make it happen. And if you look at the original British founding group of Extinction Rebellion, you'll see it's a left-wing group whose original stated intent is to use civil disobedience tied to climate change to bring down the regime. The reason why they put forward an unrealistic demand, zero carbon by 2025, is because having radicalised sufficient people with a firm belief that they or their children are going to die, they want them to be prepared to take the next step, which is to be prepared to be arrested, and then the step after that to support the overthrow of the state. Roger Hallam said to me that as a left group, they didn't support business action, they supported a state-led solution. He shied away from the label of authoritarian, but that's exactly what is implied. In her evidence to the House of Commons Committee, co-founder Gail Bradbrook said that the group believed that the country needed to mimic the wartime spirit, by which she meant the willingness of the population to submit to rationing.
But the specific measure is, first of all, let the British people know that they're going to walk into their supermarkets, possibly in just a few years' time, if we've got what the academics call a multi-breadbasket failure, and not have food on their shelves. And that's when the rioting starts, and that's when people panic, and fascism. So this is why we talk about a wartime economy, and that's why we think the shift has to absolutely move from this idea that we're going to do this within business as usual. We think that through a citizens' assembly you will come up with a package that people can get behind, because it'll have ordinary people on it who've been taught critical thinking skills and been given evidence. But as an example of what happened in wartime, there was the government concluded that it wasn't going to come from taxation. That's an unfair burden on the poor, and so they brought in rationing and went on to like a shadow factory plan, and there was more homegrown food.
Now, the Committee on Climate Change Net Zero by 2050 programme was based on the belief that you could achieve net zero without asking people to make difficult and unpopular sacrifices, nor to put back the progress we've made worldwide in reducing absolute poverty. Well, that's not what Extinction Rebellion wants. They want an authoritarian left-wing eco-government that forces people to live in the approved lifestyle. And that's not mind-reading. It's entirely there in what they say. Now, the majority of people who've joined the movement since it came to prominence probably don't want that. But their recruitment process is designed to radicalise people to the maximum extent. So you should take nothing for granted where that leads. They clearly hope that they will get a wider movement of highly committed activists prepared to be arrested and to go the whole hog. It might instead end up with highly radicalised people who decide to go underground and eschew the non-violence principles the group espouses and use violence instead. Either way, these are entirely predictable consequences of the sort of radicalisation process Rupert Read and Extinction Rebellion are promoting. I agree with everyone else that we need to take serious action on climate change. I've made that case in a number of videos responding to those who suggest we don't. I generally agree that we will see things get worse before they get better, and there will be serious consequences we will need to deal with in the future. One of those consequences is going to be dealing with groups that take the crisis and try to use it to further their own agenda. Authoritarian governments have never been to the benefit of the people, nor have they been environmentally sensitive. Now, Roger Hallam and Gail Bradbrook are probably too nice to actually become the vanguard of the leftist eco-communist revolution, which is probably why few people involved will take these warnings seriously. But the process of radicalisation that they've initiated will have unintended consequences. And at that point, they'll hold up their hands and say, well, we could never have known. And I'm here right now to say, yes, you should know. I'm here waving the flag at you, inconvenient and annoying though you may find it. Look, systems are important. When the American founding fathers created the US Constitution, they worked long and hard to come up with a system of checks and balances in the knowledge that most systems up until that point in history had descended into despotism. Every left-wing centralised system that's ever been put into place did exactly that. Dealing with the crisis doesn't justify abandoning that hard-learned lesson.